Good morning.
Good morning.
How are y'all? Good night's sleep?
Yeah.
Good. We're going to keep you for a long time today. It'll be good. Glad you rested. I'm Chris O'Brien. I'm the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center. If you heard part of this introduction last night, welcome back. If you didn't, you're going to hear some things hopefully new to you, but not new to the rest of these people. We've got a big day's worth of activities today, and mostly what you'll see me for is to stand up here and say it's time for a coffee break. I will do that on a reasonably regular basis. And for all of you who are new to the Theodore Roosevelt Center, just a quick little moment about what we do. We are creating a digital 26th President of the United States, every letter, every book, every document. So I did not last night get a chance to praise some of the folks who've done some work for us beyond. We had a student who did an internship with us last spring who tried to track down every article that Theodore Roosevelt ever wrote for things like Ladies' Home Journal and find a free copy that we can post online to our website. Sarah Griffiths did all that wonderful work for us. We haven't posted it yet. We're still going through to make sure that we can post all those links, but it's coming soon. We will call it the Sarah Griffiths Collection, or at least I will for the rest of time. It was a ton of work because he wrote an awful lot in a wide variety of places. She found things that we didn't know that you could find for free. So it's coming your way soon. For those of you who are researchers, this is one of those great moments of somebody's done all the work of pulling it together. The other couple of things about what's upcoming in the Theodore Roosevelt Center, I need to stop and take a moment and thank the folks who work for me and maybe ask them to stand up here real quick. Kelly Highland, who's somewhere. There you are, there's Kelly. Kelly's an archivist and manages our physical collections, which are growing since we moved into a new space and we now have humidity and temperature controlled archival space. Folks are starting to send us stuff. We're very happy with that. Kelly's also rewriting our collections policy because it's kind of been, we were in the basement of a library for a long time and it was a space available collections policy. Now we're actually thinking our way through what is it that we want to have, and she's spearheading that. Eric Johnson, sitting right there in the front. There you go. Eric is running the library side. We've got a new research library on the first floor. You'll get a chance to see that later. I'll talk about it in just a moment. Eric has taken collections from all over everywhere and made sense of them. It's not a circulating library. You got to come hang out with us. But we have quite nearly every Theodore Roosevelt book, certainly all we can get our hands on. It's a pretty astonishing collection. Eric says maybe not as many as I'm going to tell you, but just go with me. And we're trying to put together a whole collection of everything that Roosevelt wrote and that people wrote about him. That is a daunting task in and of itself. The other part of this, which some of you saw last night, the rest of you will get to see this afternoon, is we have what we call the Roosevelt Reading Room, which is a recreation of Roosevelt's library from his home in New York, from his home at Sagamore Hill. That is our special collections area. We have signed editions of Roosevelt's. We have first editions of Roosevelt's work. As you might imagine, we're a little bit fussy about how things happen in there, and we definitely don't loan out of that one. But Eric also organized all of that, and we encourage people to come see him, right? Come put your hands on the books. We're happy to have you do that. We'll watch you, but we're happy to have you do it. Yeah. And Dr. William Hansard is here, right there. Big hand for William, because if you read it on your way here, William probably wrote it. Between the two of us, I would say we need something about, and then about a half hour later, William would come and say, how's this? So most of the program that you're looking at right there, most every other piece of written thing, William's our outreach coordinator and public historian. And this would not have happened without those three people. Working from a distance is Gemma Kuntz, where the actual task of the Theodore Roosevelt Library is to catalog and add metadata to documents. Right now, we're all doing this. Gemma is still plugging away at the actual essence of so thankfully we have Gemma. Valerie Naylor, I haven't seen Valerie, you here? There's Valerie. Valerie is, you may have seen her stuff if you follow our site. She posts about Theodore Roosevelt in the national parks. So often the national parks that he was associated with, and even some that he wasn't, have collections of Theodore Roosevelt things. She's in the process of digitizing all of those and is quite nearly ending the run. She's headed off to Grand Canyon here, which is a significant collection. What else is left, Valerie? That's it. Grand Canyon is the last of that project. So we're looking for next projects for Valerie. If you've got any good ideas about someone who wants to be on the road and do Theodore Roosevelt things and write about them, talk to Valerie. I'm happy to say yes to any of those because it's great. They're fun to read and they're fascinating. Without those folks, we couldn't do what we do. I basically sit in a room and say yes or no. I say yes almost always. So it's a good gig. I work with great people and they like each other, which is a fantastic thing if you take a place over. It's the easiest gig I've ever had. The last little bit for me is a bit of housekeeping, a handful of things. Your program's going to say we're going to have book sales over in the Lum & Walton Hall. We're actually doing all of our book sales here. So if you want to buy a book here. We'll do signing over there this afternoon. I didn't think about having to move a cash register that's connected to the internet. So yeah, it's a plugged-in operation over here. It's much more difficult to move than what was in my head. So if you want books, there are books from all of the authors here. Please pick one up. They're happy to, I think I've talked everybody into being happy to sign them for you. Certainly talk to them about it. But the books are all for sale here. We'll have the signing down there in the library area. Last little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who are headed out with us to Medora tomorrow, it's going to be fantastic. We have a panel of all of the speakers. It's a question and answer sort of thing. They get to talk to each other. They get to talk to Clay. It's one of my favorite parts of this. There's a hike scheduled. It's supposed to be sort of like this tomorrow. If you're coming with us and you want to go on the hike, dress warm. That would be my advice. If you're a little concerned about hiking, Joe Wiegand will be there. You've seen Joe roaming around. For those of you who don't know Joe, he is the repriser, the word that he favors, of Theodore Roosevelt, who works in Medora. And if you've seen him, you may have thought that is actually Theodore Roosevelt roaming around here. The appearance is uncanny. He will be walking some folks around town. The Cowboy Hall of Fame has agreed to stay open for the entire time. So there'll be a warm spot to be if you're not a hiker like me. So plenty going on there. We'll do the panel. There'll be a lunch and all sorts of good things tomorrow. I'm forgetting one thing. What was I supposed to say? Somebody remind me. What was it? Nobody's reminding me. I must have got everything. That seems unlikely, but it's my pleasure now to introduce the president of the University of Dickinson State University. This is Steve Easton, who's up to say a few words.
I'm behind the podium because I learned from yesterday, those that were here yesterday. Thanks a lot for being back. It'll be a very exciting day. So as to not repeat the things I said yesterday, I might just give a little pitch about Dickinson State University's Theodore Roosevelt programs. The Theodore Roosevelt Center, as Dr. Chris O'Brien has described, does that incredible work of creating a digital archive, which really means digital access to. Many of you in the room know what that means, or online, but just in case there are people who are not incredibly tech savvy like me, that means if you're interested in a research project about Theodore Roosevelt, you find you could just do a Google search, Dickinson State University Theodore Roosevelt Center. That will get you to a homepage for the TR Center, and from that point, you just sort of plug words in of things that you are interested in, and then because of the amazing work that our archivists are doing, that will take you there's a few what we sometimes call encyclopedia articles. So if you put in Panama Canal, you'd get a brief overview of Theodore Roosevelt and the Panama Canal. But and those are very valuable, but what we really provide is access to the primary sources, the letters to and from Roosevelt about a particular topic. We're very proud of the fact that people all over the world use that, researchers, scholars on Theodore Roosevelt. When we say scholars, we mean all the way from folks in this room who are working on Theodore Roosevelt books, PhD dissertations, all the way down to third and fourth graders who are doing Theodore Roosevelt research projects from across the globe. I think last year we missed like 4 countries in the world or something like that. Other than that, someone from those countries had accessed that. And so the pitch I try to make on that resource is, yes, it's a valuable resource for professional trained historians. It is also a valuable resource for people like me who are just interested, and it's really fun to get to those original sources. The Theodore Roosevelt Center also, in addition to the symposium, we will have we have a speaker series. We occasionally have a guest speaker. Almost always, those are available both in person and in recognition that not everybody wants to come to North Dakota in, say, February. They're also available online when we have one of those. So just keep your, if you keep your eye out for those, there's other opportunities. Dr. Hansard is really good about putting the word out on the internet about those events. Dickinson State also has an honors college that is a bit different than honors colleges at other institutions. We have ours is, well, I shouldn't say college, we use the word program, the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program. That is our top scholarship opportunity, but it is more than a scholarship opportunity because the TRHLP students, or as they are known on campus, the TRs, they take a minor in leadership, take several courses about leadership, and we use Theodore Roosevelt as a mechanism to teach about leadership. And those students also have community service commitments. So it is a scholarship, but it's not just a sign up and get the scholarship. Those students work together, and it's a program we're very proud of. And some of the students you will see today are TRHLP students, but not all of them, because we also have a very robust history program. You've met one of our history professors, Dr. Michael Cullinane, who is our Lowman Walton Endowed Chair of Roosevelt Studies. I should mention that Dr. Cullinane, in addition to, as part of his job description at Dickinson State, he serves as our liaison to the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation. We have lots of other connections with the Presidential Library, but Dr. Cullinane, it's written into his job description, and he spends quite a bit of time working on that project. If you're interested in that, I would invite you to talk to him about that at the breaks. Dr. Cullinane is also, and I'm going to get the title wrong, Admiral. He is also the Grand High Monkey Michael Scholarship with the Theodore. What's the official title, Admiral?
TRA historian.
The Theodore Roosevelt Association's historian. We have always been blessed by a relationship with the Theodore Roosevelt Association. We feel like that's growing. We have worked on we've been working on bringing in the Journal of the Theodore Roosevelt Association into our digital collection. The Theodore Roosevelt Association had a Roosevelt Western bus tour this summer, and they were kind enough. Dr. Cullinane made me aware of that, and I said, why don't you see if they want to come by Dickinson? They were kind enough to come kind of out of their way. They were mostly in the Black Hills, Devil's Tower, and Medora, and they were kind enough to spend an afternoon with us. Met a couple of our students who did from the honors program who presented their research to them, and so that's another very active part. I mean, we really treasure our relationship with the Theodore Roosevelt Association. If you're not a member of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, you need to change that, and the Admiral or others will help you do that. And then Joe Wiegand is not officially a member of our faculty, but he is a great connection between us and the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation. Joe is in the back of the room. Can you stand up so everybody sees you, Joe? Thanks a lot for coming. He does wonderful hikes and tours, and he has really perfected the art of stepping in and out of Roosevelt so that he can both speak to you as President Roosevelt and then comment about it. And we also treasure that association. So some of the things we're doing Roosevelt is a big part of Dickinson State, and so we're really happy that you're here. And yesterday, I won't repeat the accolades. I missed some for our amazing friend Clay Jenkinson, who, as I said, got this started up. I mean, I did forget to mention one aspect of his resume. In a sense, if you count courses taken in high school while at Dickinson High, although his degree is from the University of Minnesota, his first degree, his first college courses, I think, were at Dickinson State. So we count you as an alum, Clay. We don't know if you count us, but he has certainly been a huge advocate of Dickinson State and and our role in the Roosevelt world. So, without repeating all the accolades from yesterday, let's welcome again Clay Jenkinson.
Well, good morning to all of you who are here live on the campus of Dickinson State University, and to everyone who's streaming in from around the country and around the world. We're glad you're here. We're in a beautiful day in southwestern North Dakota. We wish you were here, especially because tomorrow we're going out to the Badlands. We always end our symposia by going out on a field trip somewhere in the Badlands, and tomorrow we'll be going to the south unit of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And I know some of you are a little squeamish about the weather, for which Roosevelt would shame you. But leaving that aside, I looked it up, and the weather tomorrow is going to be 38 degrees at dawn, but 54 by the time we're hiking, and it's going to be partly cloudy and partly sunny. So in other words, a perfect day in the Badlands. Please do come. Bring jackets. If you don't have one, there are many good stores here, and you can get one. But we want you on this hike. It's not going to be tremendously strenuous. We're going to take the coach into the park, and we'll get to a pullout where we can walk over to the original entrance station of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, back when it was Old Highway 10. It's still there. It's conserved because it's a historically important part of the history of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. You probably know this, but the park was officially created in 1947 by an act of Congress. It had been a long, difficult journey to national park status. In fact, in 1946, when the park bill was on the desk of President Harry S. Truman, he vetoed it and said, in his mind, it had two problems: that the South Unit and the North Unit were not particularly associated with Theodore Roosevelt. Both of his houses had been off those two sites. And he said, and I'm sorry to have to repeat it, that in his view, the Badlands of North Dakota did not rise to national park status or quality. So that's Harry Truman. But the following year, thanks to the really important work of William Lenke, who was a historically very important congressman from North Dakota, a third unit was added. The Elkhorn Ranch unit of 218 acres was added to the north unit and the south unit proposal. And on the basis of that, President Truman signed the bill because now it had a more distinct Roosevelt connection. And so then, at that time, it was only a national memorial park, Theodore Roosevelt National Memorial Park, the only national park named for an individual. And it remained a national memorial park until 1978, when in an omnibus national parks bill, it graduated into full national park status. It's had a long and extremely interesting history. I'm writing a book about it for the University of Nevada Press. The celebration that occurred when it finally became a national park was the largest gathering of North Dakotans in North Dakota history up till that point. The people of North Dakota rushed out in their cars to Painted Canyon Scenic Overlook and had a day of extraordinary congratulation that this park had finally come to be. Now, the last thing I'll tell you is that in the original proposal before 1946, the park was actually going to extend from the bottom of North Dakota all the way up to Lake Sakakawea, to the Missouri River. It would have been 200 miles long. If that had happened, it would have been one of the world's supreme grasslands parks, as it still is in its somewhat more modest form. So do come on this hike tomorrow. We're going to have a tremendous time, and you should not let the weather get in the way. But there will be alternative activities in Medora for those of you who would rather not. The hike is about 25 or 30 minutes out. We'll spend 15 or 20 minutes there. We may see a prairie dog. They may have gone to sleep by now. But there's a prairie dog village there. And then there's a pretty good chance we'll see a bison or two on that hike also. So that's tomorrow. Tonight, you want to come to our Friday evening event. We're so excited about this. An evening with the poet laureate of North Dakota at 7:15 p.m., Denise Legimaudier. We're just honored, even thrilled to have her here tonight. So we have a big, big day, and my job is to keep us on track for time, both because of the streaming and because students' classes are moving in and out. You'll see a little bit of that as we go through the day, and we want to stay coordinated with their schedule. So I think that's enough for the moment. I'll be waiting to ask questions of our first guest this morning, but to introduce him is Niles Haich, who is the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Honors program here, and also a professor of English literature. Niles.
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of myself, Niles Haich, Dickinson State University, the TR Foundation, and Dr. Benjamin Wetzel. It is with great pleasure that I'm here this morning to introduce Dr. Wetzel. Benjamin Wetzel is a professor of history at Taylor University. He studies the intersection of American religious, political, and intellectual history in the period from 1860 to 1920. Pretty impressive. Taylor University is in, for those of you who don't know, Upland, Indiana. The university dates back to 1846. Very impressive. It is one of the oldest Christian universities in the United States. Fun fact, I was maybe 1 year from crossing paths with Dr. Wetzel at Baylor University. I taught at Baylor University as a lecturer from 2012 to 2019. So Dr. Wetzel graduated in 2011, so we just missed crossing paths. But I was there for RG3's Heisman Trophy winning season, so I was there for that. And Fixer Upper was there when I was a part of Baylor University. So I would argue that I had the better years, but nonetheless, I missed the opportunity to have cross paths with Dr. Wetzel. Dr. Wetzel holds a master's degree in history from Baylor University and a PhD in history from the University of Notre Dame. Impressively, Dr. Wetzel has published 2 books on Theodore Roosevelt, in addition to other academic publications. Dr. Wetzel has a 2023 publication in the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era titled Theodore Roosevelt and the Unionist Memory of the Civil War, Experience, History, and Politics, 1861-1918. Dr. Wetzel has given 4 conference presentations. He has also given 4 media interviews on the subject of Theodore Roosevelt specifically. Because the focus of this year's Theodore Roosevelt Symposium is on the importance of freedom struggles, we can appreciate Dr. Wetzel's imminent presentation this morning on the subject of Roosevelt, and more importantly, religious freedom. As we'll learn, religious freedom is not always easy. The words that are most telling on this subject come from Dr. Wetzel's, and I just purchased his books. Hopefully he'll sign it for me. Dr. Wetzel's book, 2021 publication, Theodore Roosevelt, Preaching from the Bully Pulpit. In chapter 2, Dr. Wetzel writes something striking about Roosevelt, which will set the scene, hopefully, for not only his presentation, but also the concept of this conference, freedom struggles. Dr. Wetzel writes something striking about Roosevelt, which is an experience that Roosevelt had while Roosevelt was a student at Harvard University between 1876 and 1880. Theodore Roosevelt, Preaching from the Bully Pulpit, Dr. Wetzel's publication, is part of a series with the Oxford University Press called Spiritual Lives. This series features famous historical figures who were not known for their religion, but whose faith played an important role in their lives. Every year, the Theodore Roosevelt Association chooses a book to win the Theodore Roosevelt Association Book Award. The award recognizes, quote, the year's most significant published book focused primarily or substantially on Theodore Roosevelt. In 2022, the Theodore Roosevelt Association selected Wetzel's book, which I hope he signs for me, as the winner of this prestigious award. And I'm about to read a line or read a passage from this book that will set the scene for religious freedom. DSU themselves hosted the Theodore Roosevelt Association in early July. I was here for that. They are made up of a group of not only sharp Theodore Roosevelt minds, but persons of high character. I chatted with these individuals. They're great, great people, the Theodore Roosevelt Association members. It was a pleasure to meet them, and their endorsement of Dr. Wetzel's book speaks volumes to his work. Dr. Wetzel writes in chapter 2 of his book that earned the Theodore Roosevelt Association Award. So here's the passage I want to read that will set the scene for the concept of religious freedom, which religion was something that when I was a lecturer at Baylor University, we always had to harmonize the concept of religion with everything that we taught. So it was always a backdrop for our lessons. So in Dr. Wetzel's book, the award-winning book from the Theodore Roosevelt Association, he writes, he, that is Roosevelt, was described as queer, crazy, not the sort to appeal at first. William Harper, one of Roosevelt's wrestling partners, gave the harshest judgment, saying the Harvard community regarded him as a freak, a poser and half crazy. Although all of this world moderately, fairly quickly called him Teddy, or Teddy had to work his way into Harvard's social life. By his own account, Roosevelt's religious devotion and regard for his personal morality did not necessarily help him fit in. Indeed, sometimes his religious activities set him apart from his classmates at Harvard. As early as October 1876, he told Bammy, his sister, that he was left all alone on Sundays when his acquaintances went into Boston. So basically, he would go to church, and his acquaintances, they wouldn't go to church. He exercised his freedom of religious choice. So let's open our minds now to learn from this brilliant Roosevelt scholar, Dr. Wetzel. Welcome, Dr. Wetzel.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Niles. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning. I'd like to thank Mike Cullinane especially for the invitation to come and to present, and to Chris O'Brien for helping with all the travel arrangements and details that were involved with this. They are not paying me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, that the digitization project at Dickinson State that we heard about from the president this morning is just a fantastic project that's going on. I've used it extensively in my own research. If you haven't checked it out, please check it out. It's just invaluable what these folks are doing and taking diverse archives from all over the country and making them publicly accessible. And to be able to zoom in on images, to be able to access these things is just a treasure trove for those interested in Theodore Roosevelt. So it's great for me to be here with you, to be on the site where TR spent some important years, and to be with you who are working on this project. So my lecture this morning, Theodore Roosevelt and the Concept of Religious Freedom, is based on the book that I wrote in 2021, Theodore Roosevelt Preaching from the Bully Pulpit. My goal today is to talk about this issue of religious freedom that Roosevelt helped promote throughout his life, to show why it matters. And the way I'll do this is to walk through TR's life and to try to tease out the religious parts of his life, the significance of it, and certainly I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have when we're finished. It's not always clear in the aftermath of Roosevelt's death just how religious he was. In the aftermath of his death, a Methodist minister named Christian Reisner was observing that many books were already written on Roosevelt, but that to him, it was disturbing that not really too many of them were talking about his religious beliefs. So Reisner made it his project to interview lots of Roosevelt's family and friends, to scour his publications, and to make the case, which he did in about 400 pages, that Roosevelt was in fact a Christian. And the quotation I'll share with you on the screen speaks to this. This is sort of the thesis of Reisner's book. Religion was the heart of his life, the creator of his ideals, the sustainer of his courage, the feeder of his faith, and the fountain of his wisdom. Without religion, the greatness of Mr. Roosevelt is inexplicable. But that was not necessarily a consensus view. Less than a decade later, a more skeptical writer, Gamaliel Bradford, wrote the following: whole books have been written about Roosevelt's religion, i.e. Reisner's. To me, they simply prove that he did not have any. And Bradford went on in a sarcastic vein to say that really, Roosevelt had no need for religion because he was his own God. That a capital G God, just wasn't really necessary. So that's sort of the debate in the 20s and 30s. But I would argue that modern historians have really achieved no greater consensus. We see, if we look at the historiography on this, in 1958, Edward Wagenknecht wrote that, yes, TR was in fact a Christian and that Bradford was the one who got it wrong. 25 years later, John Milton Cooper, in his dual biography of Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, wrote, frankly, that TR may have been a skeptic about the existence of God. A decade later, Robert Bolt swung the pendulum back in the other direction when he said TR was rather outspoken and specific about his religious beliefs. H.W. Brand's big biography of TR, the Last Romantic, wrote that TR's faith was subdued and orthodox and quietly conventional. Kathleen Dalton's major one-volume book, 2002, Theodore Roosevelt: A Strenuous Life, focused rightly on TR as a proponent of muscular Christianity. And then in a journal article in 2012, Edith Blumhofer wrote of TR as an exemplary mainline Protestant. So I would argue that historians have been all over the map in how they've tried to tease out the significance of Roosevelt's beliefs, whether he can be counted a Christian or not, and so forth. And my purpose in the lecture and in the book is not really to decide whether or not Roosevelt was a Christian. I don't know that as a historian, more than 100 years after his death, I can peer into the recesses of his heart and really answer that one way or the other. But my goal in the book was to tease out 4 themes that I saw going through his life. And so the 4 themes I hope you'll see in the presentation this morning are, first, Roosevelt is a religious pilgrim who was not static, but who evolved in his religious beliefs and practices, starting from pretty orthodox and devout youth, moving to a still serious but more detached faith as an adult. Second, Roosevelt is a bully pulpit preacher who used the language of the King James Bible all the time to exhort his fellow citizens to what he thought of as good works. Third, Roosevelt as a defender of church-state separation and an opponent of any project or law that would give special benefit to one sect or another. And then what I'll try to focus on today, with the theme of this conference, is Roosevelt as an advocate of religious freedom. And what I mean by that is that in the Gilded Age of Progressive era, when Roosevelt lived, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants still held most of the levers of power in American society. Protestantism, especially in some of the mainline denominations, was kind of the default or de facto American religion, with Catholics especially on the margins, some of the more ethnic Protestant groups on the margins, Mormons for sure on the margins. And so some of the examples I'll try to give today are how Roosevelt used his influence most of the time to help bring those groups more into the mainstream. All right, so we begin with Roosevelt's birth, October 27th, 1858 in New York City. Roosevelt's home church when he was a child was Madison Square Presbyterian Church in New York. Presbyterianism was the denomination that his mother, Martha or Mittie, grew up in. And when Roosevelt was a kid, they went to Madison Square Presbyterian. But Mittie herself was not all that serious about her faith, at least according to some of the contemporary accounts that we have. Her own parents thought she was rather lukewarm in her devotion. The guiding religious influence in the house was T.R.'s father, Theodore Sr. Theodore Sr. saw to it that his kids certainly attended church every Sunday, that they memorized Bible verses, that they would repeat or summarize the sermon for him later on in the afternoon. They would sing hymns in the household. This was a very devout kind of place that Roosevelt grew up in. And Roosevelt's sister, Corinne, would remember in her memoir later on that the children really enjoyed this, that summarizing the message and singing hymns helped make religion to be an enjoyable experience for them. And so we have TD here in that last image, what he was called as a young boy. When TR was a teenager, the family changed churches. The pastor of Madison Square Presbyterian moved on to, I think, his Union Theological Seminary, and the family moved uptown to a new congregation, the Collegiate Reformed Church of St. Nicholas. And that was a Dutch Reformed church. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Came from a long line of Dutch Reformed members, going back to 17th century Dutch New York. And Theodore, when he was 16, decided that he wanted to officially join the church. And the pastor, James Ludlow at the time, would remember later on what Roosevelt said to him on that occasion when he went to his office and met with him and said, "Yes, Pastor, I would like to become a member of the church." So this is the quotation. "I would like to become a member of the church. You know how strictly I have been raised religiously in Christian faith and denominational doctrine, and I feel now as if I ought to unite with the church. I feel that one who believes so firmly in the Bible and in Christianity as I do should say so publicly and enter openly into the active service of the church, to drill with the troops and fight in the battlefront with the soldiers of the cross. To join a church now will do me good personally and will be in obedience to the express command of Christ. I want to be a witness for Christ, a doer of the word." This is a statement that we have, but I would argue that there may be some problems with it. As far as I know, the pastor, James Ludlow, never recorded this or shared it with the public until after TR's death in 1919, when Reisner and other fan biographers were going to his acquaintances and trying to ask, what was Roosevelt like as a child? And to me, I don't know that TR at age 16 would have stood out to the pastor as someone who he needed to write down every word of what this boy was saying. So unless I'm missing a source, I don't know that we should take the statement word for word, but if the intent is roughly there's still some interesting things we can draw out from it. First, notice the military imagery. I want to drill with the troops and fight in the battlefront with the soldiers of the cross. That at least comports with later on TR's affection for all things military. And then notice the very last phrase. I want to be a witness for Christ, a doer of the word. So the phrase doer of the word comes from the book of James, where the author of the book, James, tells his readers to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And that was a favorite verse of Roosevelt. He quoted it a lot as an adult. And whether or not he said it on this occasion, it certainly keeps in the spirit of his emphasis on deeds as the final marker of someone's religion. Not so much what they believe theologically or doctrinally, but actually how they lived out their faith. So that part at least kind of matches up, I think, with what we see from him later on. 1876, TR goes to Harvard University, and in the winter, the spring of 1878, tragedy struck when Theodore Roosevelt Sr. died. And TR's diaries are very revealing. I would commend them all to you if you really want to understand the adolescent, early adult Theodore Roosevelt, to read these diaries. They're not quite daily, but pretty close in the college period. And for my money, these are the most revealing sources ever from him about his internal religious life. He'll be much more careful or detached later on, but these are quite revealing. Just a few excerpts from him and how he's dealing with the grief. June 30th, 1878, nothing but my faith in the Lord Jesus Christ could have carried me through this, my terrible time of trial and sorrow. Now that's unique and remarkable because this is one of the few times in Roosevelt's life where he actually mentions Jesus Christ. Most times he'll just talk about God or providence or some euphemism for a higher being, but here he actually mentions Jesus Christ. March 6, 1878, I think I can really and honestly say, thy will be done. That's a quotation from the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's maybe also an allusion to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane before his crucifixion, where he says, Father, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. So he's drawing on the Bible there in his time of grief. Then April 21st, 1878, it is lovely to think of us meeting in heaven and how we shall be united with the dear one who has gone before. So here he's taking comfort in Christian doctrines of heaven, believing Theodore Sr. is there and that he'll meet him again someday. And this will stand in contrast to some things we'll look at in a moment. So TR's, especially his grief, the way he processes this during his time at Harvard, he's probably drawing most explicitly on the historic Christian tradition through these writings, through his copying of a hymn that one of his sisters sent to him. And I should mention also that he's a prolific Sunday school teacher during his 4 years at Harvard. And this is, I think, done partly out of aristocratic sort of giving back to the less fortunate. But I think it also comes from a place of true devotion where he's spending his Sunday mornings in church, but then also teaching underprivileged children in the wider Boston community. So again, we'll kind of see this as maybe what I would argue kind of the peak of his religious devotion, but certainly how it continues to play a role with him going forward. Many of you know that at the end of his time at Harvard, Roosevelt met, courted, and then married Chestnut Hill girl, Alice Hathaway Lee. They were married October 27th, his birthday, in 1880. And he and Alice were married for 4 years. Roosevelt was an assemblyman in New York for a number of terms here. They lived apart often, trying to get him back and forth to Albany. And then many of you in the room will know of the great tragedy that struck Roosevelt in February 1884, where both Alice and his mother, Mittie, died in the same house on the same day in Manhattan. And Roosevelt had kind of dropped off a little bit from keeping his diary at that point, but he took it up again that day to draw this big black X. And I believe I've gotten this image from the digital library here. And then this one haunting line, the light has gone out of my life. So Roosevelt's grief here and the way he dealt with it was strikingly different, I think, from 1878 with Theodore Sr.'s death. I say in the book that in 1878, Roosevelt went to the Bible, but in 1884, he went to the West to deal with his grief. And so we kind of look at that part of this next. Roosevelt came to the Dakota Territory then, and the site of the 2 ranches that he had purchased, and never lived here full time. He went back and forth between here and New York. But found this place, this landscape, as a healing remedy for this terrible tragedy that he had suffered. And he makes this an interesting comment in one of his hunting books in 1888, that black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. I just love that line. Black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough. You have to keep moving. You have to stay active. Here's how you deal with your demons. Here's how you deal with grief. You have to outrun it. And that seems to be, I think, what a lot of historians think he's doing this time in the Dakota Territory. He assumed, I think at first, that he would never remarry. There was some Victorian precedent for those in his kind of upper class social circles for that. But back into his life, suddenly, a year or two after Alice's death, came his childhood friend and sometime sweetheart, Edith Caro. And they met accidentally at the front door of Bammy's house one day. And soon enough, they were exchanging letters. They were seeing one another secretly. And before long, they were engaged. And Roosevelt wrote a very interesting letter to Bammy in 1886. Shamefacedly, I think, telling her that yes, the stories that the newspapers were printing were true, that he was in fact engaged to Edith, and sorry you found out that way, not me telling you. But he has this very interesting line in here about, were I sure there were a heaven, my one prayer would be I might never go there. And I think he meant two things by that. One, I think he was thinking of Alice and that he would be ashamed in the afterlife to see Alice once he had remarried, once he had married Edith. So that's kind of one layer of it. But the other layer is, notice that first line, were I sure there were a heaven, meaning that he's already beginning to doubt some of the traditional Christian doctrines about the afterlife, about heaven. He took comfort in heaven after Theodore Sr.'s death in 1878, wanting to see him again there. Here, though, he seems to evince a kind of skepticism about that. So again, it's part of that pilgrimage, part of that evolution in his faith. Then we come to Roosevelt's time as Civil Service Commissioner. We heard a little bit about that last night from TJ and that wonderful presentation that he gave. And then as New York Police Commissioner. So the theme I would want to draw out from these years is Roosevelt is a kind of preacher of righteousness, a biblical phrase was often attributed to him, and his crusade for all kinds of moral causes, or at least things that he saw as morality. So just a reminder first, by 1895, we see his growing family. He and Alice had their daughter, Alice, who was born right at the time that the first Alice passed away. And then we see Ted, Ethel, Kermit, and Archie, Quentin not yet having arrived. So this is a visual for him, a context for his family at this time. And then as police commissioner. So as Civil Service Commissioner, he's in all these sort of minor crusades about making sure the Civil Service Reform Act is followed, making sure that the deputy postmaster, the street cleaning commissioner is not just a political appointment, but somebody who actually has some kind of qualifications, who's passed the civil service test. And post offices, he thinks, in Baltimore, Milwaukee, and other places are very corrupt. And so he's on these crusades to kind of clean up the civil service. And then as New York City Police Commissioner, I think we'll hear more about this later on today as well. He's on all kinds of crusades as well, most famously with the Sunday closing law related to selling of alcoholic beverages on Sunday. And there's this quote that I learned last night at the exhibit. It's actually not really in his writings, but is attributed to him by Herman Hagedorn. So we'll say it's at least roughly what he thought, if maybe not his exact words. Aggressive fighting for the right is the noblest sport the world affords. So there's never a moral cause, there's never a crusade that TR doesn't want to leap into. And so that morality, or at least as he perceives it and interprets it, really grounds what he's doing as a reformer in these years. I'll draw out a few more examples from his time as police commissioner. So we mentioned the Sunday alcohol law, but also his famous midnight rambles, where he walks through the streets of New York City looking for policemen who are drunk or sleeping or taking a supper break when they should have been on patrol. He takes his reporter friends like Jacob Rees along with him and makes for all this great publicity. And he's clearly one of these celebrities in the Gilded Age for what he's doing. From the religious side, there's one or two episodes too I'd like to point out from this time. So in 1895, right at the end of his time as police commissioner, he gives an address to the Liberal Club of Buffalo, New York, in which he talks about his police force and the ways that promotions are made without regard to religious discrimination. And you might hear that and not really bat an eye at that because I hope that's a principle that we all agree with. But we have to appreciate the context of Gilded Age America, where, again, Catholics and Jews were particularly on the margins of American life. And there might be certain communities where there was pressure to promote someone based on the fact that the person was a Protestant, or in a Catholic neighborhood to have a Catholic policeman or something like that. And Roosevelt's beliefs, as he put them forward in this address that was then published, was that he wanted to make promotions on merit and not really taking into account whether someone was a Protestant or a Catholic or a Jew, but that all men would be treated on their merits as men. He also spoke to that issue of church and state separation by advocating that schools and school boards should be non-sectarian. And this is a controversy in this period, should the Bible be read in the public schools? If so, with comment, without comment? Roosevelt is really an advocate for non-sectarianism here, and not the government through the schools should not favor one religion over another. And he concluded this talk by mentioning that he had support of Methodists, I think, who had invited him to give the talk, and then a Catholic priest was sitting on the stage with him. And again, you might not think too much of that, but at the time, Catholics, and especially Catholic priests, would have been very much suspect in the eyes of certain Protestants. And so Roosevelt was making gestures towards religious freedom and religious ecumenism by highlighting all the different kinds of groups that he was trying to support and that were supporting him. Then there's also this other interesting episode that happens during his time as police commissioner that he recounted in his autobiography. There was a German speaker, came to New York, who was very anti-Semitic and who was going through New York City speaking horrible things about the Jews. And some of New York's Jewish leaders came to Roosevelt to ascertain whether this person would really be allowed to speak and if anything could be done about it. And with the First Amendment and the right to speech, Roosevelt had limited options for prohibiting him from speaking in New York, but he tried to make him a laughingstock. And so the decision he made was that this person will be guarded by an entire squad of Jewish policemen. And so, writing about this in his autobiography, Roosevelt said, the proper thing to do was to make him ridiculous. He made his harangue against the Jews under the active protection of some 40 policemen, every one of them a Jew. It was the most effective answer possible to the bigotry and hate this person was spouting. So I'm sure reasonable people could disagree about whether this was the proper tactic or not, but I think the intent behind it was, again, to make Herr Albert a laughingstock, that he was going on a crusade against Jews, and yet he owed his safety and his protection to Jewish policemen. So again, we see some of the ways Roosevelt was maybe doing, I don't want to overstate it, but he was doing some things for gesturing towards equality for marginalized groups. Biography-wise then, he gets on the outs with his other police commissioners in New York City for a variety of reasons, and with William McKinley's election in 1896, he has an opportunity to go into a minor cabinet post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, plays a minor role in helping to bring about the Spanish-American War, and then famously in 1898 resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to become an appointed lieutenant colonel, to gather up this regiment, the Rough Riders, and then to lead them into battle in Cuba. And so he does that, he charges up San Juan Hill, he gets a promotion to colonel, not the Medal of Honor that he coveted and lobbied for. But he comes back then in August of 1898 as a celebrity and a war hero at a crucial election in New York's history, where they were electing a governor and the current Republican was corrupt and couldn't be renominated. But Roosevelt sort of comes to the rescue of the party, and he'll be the Republican candidate for governor of New York and will win in 1898. One of the lesser known things about Roosevelt, although we heard a little bit about it last night, was his historical books. And without doing an exhaustive count, he writes at least 6 or 7 pretty serious histories, not all of which have weathered the criticism all that well over 100 plus years, but serious books for their time. And even though he was governor of New York, he takes the summer to write a biography of Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell, to refresh your memory perhaps, a Puritan revolutionary in the 1640s and 50s in England. He's Lord Protector at the time of the interregnum before the restoration of the monarchy. And It's not a great book on Oliver Cromwell, but it is a great book on Theodore Roosevelt to understand what he's thinking. One of the critics at the time said that this was a fine study of Cromwell's qualifications to be governor of New York. That this book tells you just as much about TR as it does about Cromwell. So there's a couple interesting things as he's talking about religion and Puritanism to help us have a window into TR's own life. So a couple quotes from this. It was also the era in which the old theological theory of the all-importance of dogma came into sharp conflict with the now, healthily, general religious belief in the superior importance of conduct. So deeds, not creeds. That's what really matters. Conduct is the final arbiter of the worth of someone's religion. And again, there are hundreds of different creeds or shades of creeds, all of which are believed in with equal devoutness by their followers. Therefore, in a workaday government, it is necessary to insist that none shall interfere with any other. So the government shouldn't favor one over the other. This is a church-state separation issue, but it's also a gesture towards ecumenism, that everybody believes in their own religion with a kind of fervor, and that they shouldn't be discriminated against just because they belong to an unpopular religious belief. Now, there are boundaries to that, and we can talk about that later on in the Q&A if you like. He's not necessarily an advocate for every single religion that's out there, but for his time and context, he's pretty broad-minded in that regard. We know Roosevelt becomes vice president then in 1900, and with William McKinley's assassination and death in 1901, accidentally ascends to the presidency. So the next little bit here, I'll talk about Roosevelt's gestures toward religious freedom as president. Again, for context, here's his family now in the White House, with the 6 children, Quentin now included in this. And then the final picture there is Grace Reformed Church in Washington, D.C., which is where Roosevelt chose to worship when he was president. Edith was an Episcopalian and actually pretty devoted to the Episcopalian Church. And when they were at home in Long Island, they went to Christ Episcopal Church, and Roosevelt went with her and enjoyed that service, I think. But for all his ecumenism, he really did prefer the Dutch Reformed Church, or if he couldn't find a Dutch Reformed Church, the German Reformed Church in D.C. And so actually, Edith took the kids to an Episcopal church in D.C., and Roosevelt went by himself to Grace Reformed Church when he was president. Unless there was a naughty child who was in need of fatherly correction, then that child was compelled to go with him as well, to have a close eye kept on him. But I just find it interesting that, again, for all his insistence on the validity of all religions and so forth, or at least all Christian denominations, that he did have a preference for the Reformed service. So now I'd like to mention 3 incidents, 3 different groups, and how Roosevelt, I think, helped bring these groups more into the mainstream. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president in 1906 to appoint a Jew to a cabinet-level position when he made Oscar Strauss the Secretary of Labor and Commerce. So again, for context, this is a time when there are persecutions of Jews in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and there's waves of European Jews coming to America's shores. There's anti-Semitism in American popular belief, and Roosevelt had some of that as well. But this was a time where Roosevelt wanted to make a gesture on behalf of America's Jews. And again, I don't want to overstate it, because in his private correspondence, he indulged in prejudices and in stereotypes that were unfair and hateful. But he tells us his Protestant pastor friend, Lyman Abbott, in 1905, "I like when I can to appoint a Jew." And part of that, I think, is to make sure that Jews feel they have a chance in America, that they don't become communists or something like that, which should have been an accusation that was in the air in his time. But also, I think, out of ideological commitment to fairness of all, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion. So this is a landmark gesture in the history of the presidency as to religious life, that Roosevelt appoints Strauss as Secretary of Labor and Commerce. Then we come to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church. Some of you know the history of the Mormons, how they were kind of driven from state to state in the antebellum period, from New York and Ohio, Illinois, Missouri. Their leader, Joseph Smith, killed in Illinois in the 1840s, and then Brigham Young leading this massive historic trek to Utah, which is technically not in the United States when they first get there in the 1840s. And one of the things that provoked the hatred towards the Mormons was their practice of polygamy. And one of the things that kept them from being recognized fully as Americans, prohibited Utah from kind of gaining full recognition in the United States, was this polygamy issue. And there's court cases and lots of good scholarship on that issue. In 1891, the church's leader had a revelation that polygamy was to cease. And with the cessation of polygamy, many of the barriers to being recognized in the mainstream also went away. And Utah then, by the early 20th century, has elected, the Utah legislature has elected Reed Smoot to be one of its senators. The problem with Reed Smoot is, number one, he's a Mormon, but also he's a Mormon apostle, which is something like a Catholic cardinal. I mean, he's a very high-ranking member in the church. And the Senate for years holds hearings over whether Reed Smoot is fit to assume his seat in the Senate. Roosevelt played a quiet role in this. He had his own negative views about Mormonism, especially early on in his career. He didn't like the fact that Smoot was an apostle. But once he found out that Smoot was not a polygamist, had never been a polygamist, that he was a loyal Republican who was likely to vote for the measures of his administration, he lent his quiet support to Smoot getting his Senate seat, which he eventually did and would serve well into the 1920s and 30s as one of Utah's senators. And later on, in recounting this episode to a friend, Roosevelt wrote, "If Mr. Smoot had obeyed the law, it would be an outrage to turn him out because of his religious belief." And again, that what he thinks about baptism for the dead or the scriptures of the Book of Mormon, that's really not all that pertinent to whether he can sit in the Senate or not. Roosevelt did urge him to no avail to give up the apostleship, that he really shouldn't hold offices in church and state, but he did become a supporter of Smoot. Then lastly, when Roosevelt announced in 1904 that he would not run for what would be essentially a third term in 1908, that left the election wide open in 1908, but Roosevelt supported his friend and cabinet member, William Howard Taft. Taft belonged to the Unitarian Church, and Unitarians did and do deny the divinity of Jesus Christ. They're not Trinitarian Christians, they're Unitarians. And again, in a very kind of Protestant America in 1908, there's controversies in evangelical churches especially over whether you can vote for someone who doesn't believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ, that this is unorthodox and it also doesn't seem very American. Roosevelt coaches Taft on how to respond to these criticisms of his denominational preference or his religious beliefs. And he tells Taft to invoke Jefferson and Lincoln, both of whom were accused, I would say, sort of rightly, of not really holding to Orthodox Christian beliefs, but both of whom were pretty darn good presidents. And that he should talk about Jefferson and Lincoln, and then he should read from the book of James, and particularly the parts about being doers and not hearers of the word only, and about the part in James chapter 2 of faith without works being dead. That works was what really mattered. And he would tell, in another context, that I myself, Roosevelt said, am mighty weak on the Calvinistic doctrine of justification by faith, but I'm very strong on James's view of salvation by works. Okay, well, there's some historic, biblical, and theological problems with that. But the emphasis on works, the emphasis on deeds comes through there. And after Taft was successfully elected in 1908, Roosevelt publicly responded to some of these accusations, and he writes an open letter to this poor piano salesman in Dayton, Ohio, J.C. Martin, who had criticized Taft for being a Unitarian. This multi-page letter, Roosevelt excoriates this writer for daring to bring into a public election somebody's religious beliefs. That's un-American. We don't have religious tests for office in this country, Roosevelt says. And that Taft's beliefs are purely his own private concern. It is a matter between him and his maker. It's not for public consumption. It's not publicly relevant. All you need to worry about is whether he's a good moral citizen who will further the progress of the United States, and not about what his doctrines are related to Jesus Christ or to theological matters. So again, I think all those things illustrate that commitment to religious diversity. I would be remiss not to say just a couple words, especially in this setting, about the role that nature played in Roosevelt's religious universe. Just a couple quotations about the spiritual experiences that Roosevelt had there. Going back to 1887, he wrote to his sister Anna, or Bammy, writing about being in an Italian cathedral. Milan's Duomo Cathedral really awes me. It gives me a feeling I've never had elsewhere except among very wild, chasm-rent mountains, or in the vast pine forest. So that spiritual feeling you get in a cathedral, he also gets in nature. Or speaking about Yosemite, the first night was clear and we lay in the open on beds of soft fir boughs among the huge cinnamon-colored trunks of the sequoias. It was like lying in a great, solemn cathedral, far vaster and more beautiful than any built by the hand of man. Just at nightfall, I heard, among other birds, thrushes, which I think were Rocky Mountain hermits, the appropriate choir for such a place of worship. So again, notice the religious language there. And this is actually in keeping with some of what the Bible says about this. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." And so in that way, he's keeping with Christian tradition in experiencing God in nature. The Bible says this is one of the ways you find out about God, is by experiencing his creation. And so one of the things Roosevelt, part of his spiritual religious universe, is certainly by being in nature, and that leads into his promotion of conservation. After the presidency, he goes to Africa for this year-long safari in British East Africa, and then he makes his way back through Europe, kind of this grand tour before he arrives back in 1910 in the United States. But he actually gets this invitation to attend the Edinburgh Missions Conference that was being held in 1911. And in religious history, this is a landmark conference because in Edinburgh were gathered representatives of many, many, many Protestant denominations, putting aside their particular traditions to work for the worldwide goal of evangelization. And Roosevelt was given the invitation to come as a representative of the Dutch Reformed Church. And his travel schedule precluded him from going, but he did write a response, and I think a letter that was meant to be read at the conference. Here's just a little part of this. In missionary work, and he was a big supporter of missions in Africa, it is imperative to remember that a divided Christendom can only imperfectly bear witness to the essential unity of Christianity. I believe that without compromise of belief, without loss of the positive good contained in the recognition of diversities of gifts, the Christian churches may yet find a way to cordial cooperation. So again, that theme of Baptists and Presbyterians might disagree about infant baptism, Episcopalians like bishops, and Presbyterians and Baptists don't, and so forth. But if we work together, we can cooperate in this broad goal that we all have. And so don't worry so much about what particular church you belong to, but focus on the positive good that's coming out of it. By 1910, 11, 12, Roosevelt is now a strong critic of Taft for a variety of reasons I won't go into here. But by 1912, he's decided to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. And when he felt that he had been deprived of rightfully won delegates at the convention in 1912, he and his followers marched out, formed the Bull Moose, or Progressive Party, launched the second convention in Chicago a few weeks later, and Roosevelt was determined to run as the third party candidate. And in both of his speeches, to the Republican convention and then to the Progressive convention in Chicago, he has this very interesting phrase at the end of his speech, where he's talking about battling for the right, and then he says, "We stand in Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." So what is this? This is from the book of Revelation. This is the end of history according to the New Testament, when Christ will return. They'll have this climactic battle with Satan, when Satan will be defeated, and Christ will take his followers to heaven. The kingdom of God will be fully realized. That's happening now, Roosevelt seems to be saying, in 1912. Edmund Morris, the great biographer of TR, suggests that this is unusual language for him. The apocalyptic tone is somewhat unusual for him, but the religious imagery, the drawing on the Bible, that's very common throughout TR's life. And I think he just had too much coffee or something that morning. I don't think he really thought this is Armageddon, but he's using that kind of end times language to talk about the stakes for which he believes the Progressive Party is fighting. And this is not an anomaly. It's very much part of that progressive campaign. So the campaign issues this publication, Progressive Battle Hymns, featuring Roosevelt and his running mate Hiram Johnson there on the front. And these hymns include traditional Christian favorites like "Nearer My God to Thee" that are purely devotional, some secular, sacred blended ones like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and then the hymn to Roosevelt that are not sure who they're worshiping with that one, okay? Right? But very much a religious kind of aura about this. Ethel writes about this, his daughter. She's a witness at the Chicago Convention. Journalists are talking about this is a revival meeting. It's hardly a political convention. So more scholarship probably needs to be done on that. But again, the religious aura very much is a flavor that's going on here. Well, we know he loses, and it seems to be one of Roosevelt's ways of dealing with loss throughout his life is to have some kind of strenuous activity. And so he undertakes his last great adventure by going to Brazil, to South America in 1913. 1914, a trip that evolved from a speech-giving trip to a wildlife collecting trip to an exploration of an unknown river. And what's significant about this from the religious point of view is that one of the planners of this trip was Father John Zahm, a Catholic priest affiliated with Notre Dame, who's sitting on the very far left of that picture on the left as you're looking at it. Father Zahm was a progressive and a supporter of Roosevelt at a time when it was unpopular to support Roosevelt. He was also a Darwinian scientist and got some of his books prohibited by Catholic hierarchies because of what he was suggesting there. He and Roosevelt were friends, and Zahm planned some of this trip, and I'd recommend to you Candace Miller's River of Doubt. It's a great tale of this trip. Again, we might not think too much of this, but for Roosevelt to be closely associated with a Catholic priest like this was something that would have given pause to some of the more hotter kinds of Protestants. So Zahm helps plan this trip. He doesn't actually go down the River of Doubt with Roosevelt because he doesn't really like to work very much, and he wants to be carried around in a chair and things like this. And Roosevelt ships him back to eventually to America before they actually get on the river. But they have this friendship and this cooperation that has to do with this trip to Brazil, in which Roosevelt almost dies and doesn't make it back, and really not the same person afterward. Well, finally, then, the last thing I'd like to talk about here before we wrap up is Roosevelt's religiously tinged support for World War I. He hated Woodrow Wilson for a variety of reasons and was writing regularly for publications about how the U.S. should be more and more involved in World War I. Those writings were eventually compiled into 4 books, and they have titles like Fear God and Take Your Own Part, or another one, The Foes of Our Own Household, which is a biblical phrase that Edith gave him that he was working on for that book. And if you read his World War I rhetoric, it's hard to escape the religious influence and the way that Roosevelt drew on the Bible for this. And even obscure passages. He'll talk about the curse of Meroz from the book of Judges, those who did not come to the aid of the Lord. And he's fearful that the U.S. is falling into the curse of Meroz, that we need to come to the aid of those like Belgium who are being injured and hurt by the Germans. And he tries to kind of resurrect the Rough Riders, and we know that doesn't go anywhere, that Wilson prohibits that for a variety of probably good reasons. But all 4 of his sons will serve in World War I. And Quentin, the youngest, will pay the ultimate price for his service, being shot down in France in July 1918. And then Roosevelt himself will die only 6 months after that. And I don't know, medically, you could say he died of a broken heart. There's lots of other issues that he had going on. But that grief for Quentin was deep. And so just one more example I'll give of kind of the biblical religious language Roosevelt uses in this support for World War I. 1915, 19 centuries ago, in the greatest of all books, we were warned that whoso loses his life for righteousness shall save it, and that he who seeks to save it shall lose it. So this is a paraphrase of what Jesus says in the Gospels, and Roosevelt's applying it to the war. You can't be afraid to die in a righteous cause. You have to be willing to lay down your life if you really want to keep it for eternity. And of course, Quentin paid with his body for what Roosevelt advocated in that particular case. So what I've tried to show through this is kind of these 4 themes, again, that I think pervade Roosevelt's life as a religious pilgrim who moves from point A to point B theologically in his own church attendance. Well, he was always a church attender, but in his level of personal piety and devotion, Roosevelt is someone who used the language of righteousness, morality in the Bible to promote various causes that he believed in. As someone who was concerned about the separation of church and state, wanted to defend that at all costs. And then finally, Roosevelt is someone who I think opened the door, I don't want to, again, overstate it, but opened the door to more and more marginalized groups coming a little bit into the mainstream through his emphasis on deed and not creed. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was outstanding. I think you gave us an enormous amount to think about here, and I have a number of questions, and I know the audience does too, and we have about 20 minutes here. So let me start with this. Place yourself on that spectrum. You started off by saying in early biography said that he was a very serious Christian and it should never be doubted. And a few years later, he was really only nominally a Christian and maybe not at all. After spending years thinking about this and writing about it and looking carefully at the record, where do you place him?
I think Reisner really overstates it. Some of the testimony is really questionable in hindsight. I mean, he has Warren G. Harding as a moral authority on TR's life, but Harding's having affairs while he's in the White House and this kind of thing. So Reisner, I think, had a thesis in mind, and he was going to prove it come heck or high water. I think it's strongest when he's young, and he's, again, a lifelong churchgoer, supporter of missions, reader of the Bible, brings the Bible with him in Pilgrim's Progress and other books like that to Africa when he's on his safari. But I think politics consumed him the longer he was in life, and I think his belief in God never faded. The idea that he's an atheist or something, there's no evidence for that. But I think it was a second, third, or fourth priority in his life after his political career and his family and things like that.
So out here, you know, we like to think that he transferred his spiritual energies and dynamism to the West. He speaks of trees as cathedrals, and the statements he makes about the Grand Canyon and the magnificence of the Badlands of North Dakota. It feels as if a better church for him in many respects was the outdoors, the sublime.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, he encounters God in nature going all the way back to some of his main hunting trips. And even though he tries to find churches to go to, there are times in his writings where he'll say, well, Edith and I cut church this morning and we just went on a horseback ride, or we went out into nature, or something like that. And so I think one of his ways of worshiping or of experiencing God was to be out in nature. And I'm not an expert on the Dakota context per se, but my impression was doing the research that Protestant churches, at least of his variety, would have been harder to find in the kind of on the frontier out here than what he would have in New York City. And certainly theological guidance from pastors and so forth was kind of missing. And so I think that if you're talking about the religious experience during Dakota Territory time, I think there were fewer options available to him.
Yeah, so you mentioned early in your lecture the phrase muscular Christianity, and for those here who don't know what that is, please explain it.
Yeah, it's a great point too. So Kathleen Dalton does a great job in spelling this out in her book, but muscular Christianity idea is this Victorian notion that the churches have become too feminized, that they focused on gentle Jesus, meek and mild, at the expense of Christ, the man's man who overturned tables in the temple and had this band of disciples and things like this. And so the growth of the YMCA, for example, the Young Men's Christian Association, very much in keeping with that theme. Gender in Roosevelt is a broad theme in and of itself. It's been written about very well by Gail Biederman, by Kristen Hoganson, by other great scholars of that issue. I would just say that, yeah, to his conception of Christ religion, of Christianity, there's a masculine component to that, and certainly a very activist kind of mentality, as opposed to saying your prayers in quiet in the back of the church or something like that. You're supposed to live this out through action, through striving, through moral crusading. And again, I think we kind of see that theme going through his political life.
Soldiers for Christ.
Right, absolutely.
Fighting battles in the world for
Absolutely.
righteousness.
Right.
It's
right.
not about piety as much as it is about doing good things in the world, but with a righteousness as the motivating force.
Yes, and he's not alone in this. I mean, very much in keeping with a larger kind of mainline Protestant milieu, comes out most clearly in World War I. Harry Emerson Fosdick is a Baptist pastor who goes to the front lines in World War I and comes back saying, the troops are so great, they don't really care about their souls, they're just fighting for righteousness. That's the end of Roosevelt's life, but Roosevelt's partaking of that broader kind of liberal Protestant emphasis on righteousness and democracy in America is kind of all the same thing. And there's blind spots to that, obviously, but Roosevelt's kind of in that social gospel vein by the end of his life.
I want to turn to the audience, but before, just a question that you invited us to ask you. There were limits to his religious tolerance. You said if we ask you, you will say more about that.
Sure. So he's pretty tolerant, even though he has his own preferences. But there are limits to this. So if you read African Game Trails, he's got some very negative things to say about what he sees as kind of traditional African animist religions, and of course how well he understood those is a whole issue, it's a whole separate issue. But he kind of just sees it as devil worshipping and not something that really rises to the idea of religion. Again, I'm not an expert on his views of Native Americans, but he does have an experience, I think it's the Navajo reservation, where he's taken in to see some of the behind-the-scenes religious rituals there. And he comes out of that thinking that it's weird and certainly not something he wants to go along with, but yet seeing a kind of cultural value in it. And again, I think we'll hear more about that as we go forward. I heard a little bit about it yesterday too. Mormonism, again, he evolves on that. There's a very interesting article that Dwayne Junt forwarded to me in the TRA journal from maybe 10 years ago that I wish I had read before I had done the book, where he does really progress over the course of his life in respecting Mormonism, but as a young person, he's very negative on. He said Utah can never be a state as long as polygamy is being practiced in the region. So again, there's limits, there's boundaries to this, but I think for the time, if we're looking at him in context, he's pretty broad-minded.
What about Islam?
Yes, good question. So as a boy, his family takes these long extended trips through Europe, and then they go to the Middle East on one occasion, and he has very negative things to say as a boy about howling dervishes and sort of things like that he sees in Islamic civilization. As an adult, I hesitate to go too far into this without checking, but he gives a speech in Khartoum, I think it is, when he's on his way back to Europe, and there's been some revolutionary activity there, and he makes the students very mad about some of the things he says about colonization, and part of that's in Islamic context. So I think there's an ambivalence there in him, that I think he sees Islam as an Abrahamic religion that's been around for centuries, but he still wants to keep it at arm's length in some way too.
Tell me if this is an oversimplification, that his religious respect and tolerance really is mostly embraced by the Judeo-Christian tradition.
I think that's fair.
And he's okay with a number of American subsets of that. But when you get to the boundaries of the Judeo-Christian religion, his respect begins to drop.
I think that's right. Yes, I think that's exactly right.
Do you have questions for our scholar here? Yes, here.
Yeah, you mentioned,
Wait, the microphone will be coming.
you mentioned the ongoing controversies or discussion on TR, what religion did he follow and did he believe in God and all that. I recall reading a lot of books on Abraham Lincoln with that same controversy. It seems those two, there was a lot of similarity where people would project what their religious beliefs were into those two great presidents. Any comments?
Yeah, I think that's mostly correct. We have a human tendency, I think, in our heroes or idols to want them to think like we do and to be willing to stretch evidence to kind of fit them in that mold. I think Reisner is certainly doing in that book. What strikes me, again, is the most helpful way of thinking about Roosevelt is change over time. And I think that works with Lincoln, too. That both of them grew up in the church, for sure. Lincoln, it appears, during the Civil War, actually became more interested in Christianity and more religious. And his second inaugural address, one of his last written statements, is full of theological wisdom about the Civil War as God's judgment on the nation for the sin of slaveholding. Now that's a really profound thing, and almost no other religious voices in America could get close to that. Just so stuck in partisanship. Roosevelt, I think, goes the other way in the sense of being devout as a child and as a young man, and then as an adult, walking further and further away from maybe what Theodore Sr. would have wanted him to practice. So I think you're right, though. We project onto these people what we want to see. But I think the change over time element and being alert to that is really helpful in making those final conclusions.
Other questions? Yes, here. Go ahead. Microphone is coming.
So I wonder if he ever brought up in his writings that you studied the very entrenched Presbyterian belief, and oft stated, it's from a biblical verse, Genesis 2:15, that we are stewards of the earth and we have a responsibility to care for it. I wonder if he ever made that connection between his Presbyterian early upbringing, and his reverence for conservation later in his life.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is I don't recall him making an explicit link between what some call the cultural mandate to fill the earth and subdue it, to be caretakers of creation. but it's certainly broadly in keeping with what he would have been advocating for as a conservationist. And just because I don't remember him saying it doesn't mean he never said it. But I think the proof texting with him, it's usually a broader image or theme or principle from the Bible that he's bringing in. His audience was familiar with the Bible. Most, educated people and even non-educated people were familiar with the Bible in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. But he doesn't often say, unless it's like the Ten Commandments or the Golden Rule. Now, this verse should really apply to what we're doing. So the themes, the images, those things he probably drawing on more implicitly than explicitly. But yeah, thank you for that.
So I recall reading that Theodore Roosevelt, he sent these letters out to various members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that he was really in favor of the large families that they had. And so that was an aspect that he could appreciate of their religion. I don't know. I was curious if you had other examples, maybe from Judaism or other religions, where he kind of took pieces that he really liked.
Oh, yeah, that's good. To think about that a little bit. So the emphasis on large families would certainly be correct. And to be honest, he's living in a pre-artificial contraceptive time, at least in kind of what's allowed to be disseminated through the mail and information and so forth. Not to say people weren't practicing in their own ways, but yeah, the large families is good. The concern about race suicide, that obviously has its ugly side to it for sure. But his emphasis on expanding what he thinks of as kind of the English-speaking peoples or white culture, definitely writes letters to people that you're good American citizens with your 10 children and whatever. I don't know if I can think of examples off the top of my head where he writes to certain groups. He'll write to some Catholics and talk about the good charitable work that Catholic organizations are doing. And again, he has his favorite priests like Father John Zahm or Father Charles Curran, who are sort of allies with him. And he'll say other things behind their back to them, like calling Zahm a funny little Catholic priest to Kermit or one of his children. But as a good politician, he will butter up his audience, his religious audience. Maybe the last example I'll think of is he's concerned about the Methodist vote for some reason in 1904. And he doesn't choose Charles Fairbanks because Fairbanks is a Methodist, but he wants Fairbanks to see if we can't get at the Methodist vote a little bit more. And they kind of use that religious alliance to build up the Methodists, and it turns out the Methodists are actually quite strong supporters of TR throughout most of his career anyway. But I have to think a little bit more about it.
I'm guessing that TR's righteousness would have made him be okay with large Mormon families, but 100% against polygamy in any of its forms.
110% against polygamy, yes.
There's a paradox there, of course.
Yes, yeah.
Huh. Who knew? Other questions? Yes, over here, Valerie. So be right there.
You mentioned TR defending Taft for being a Unitarian, but TR and Alice got married in a Unitarian church in Brookline.
Yes,
I've always been curious about why, because that was very early in his life. He was, 22? Do you have more on that?
I've been asked that before, and when I was in the final stages of editing, I really looked very hard as I could to find out the tradition of the Lees, the religious tradition, and if Unitarianism was in fact that tradition, or if they had just picked that church for the capacity or the prestige. And for whatever reason, I just couldn't find what denomination Alice would have grown up in. I think Unitarianism, given that region in New England, that's kind of where it would have been most popular. The aristocratic kind of background of the Lees and their many relatives in that area would make Unitarianism a likely choice. Alice, I guess what I can say about that is Alice joins a Presbyterian church with him once they're married in New York City. It's Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and Roosevelt writes, "Now we are one in everything." That whatever her tradition was, it wasn't Presbyterian. So I'm going to thank Unitarian that she joined the Presbyterian church with him and she took on his religious denomination rather than the other way around.
So, Benjamin, Roosevelt is nothing if not prolific. So it's not as if he left much on the floor. We pretty much know what he thinks. You really have scoured the documents. If the heart of Christianity is belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, born in the womb of a virgin who ascended to heaven on the third day, from my reading, there's very little evidence in Roosevelt of ever thinking of Jesus in that way.
Yep. The written evidence on Jesus Christ is sparse. I think he would have said that given the traditional churches he grew up in as a teenager, as a young adult. But he doesn't say it in his own writings later on. And those are the things I say, they're kind of buried in his heart that I can't answer one way or the other. Lack of evidence doesn't mean it's not there. But I don't see, and this is a little bit what some of these writers are saying too, I don't see a love of Jesus Christ in his writings. He's not Billy Sunday, okay? I mean, he's not or Billy Graham or D.L. Moody or these kind of figures. Or Jimmy Carter, right? That's just not him. And part of that's Victorianism, that he doesn't wear his faith on his sleeve. That's part of the culture. He's also married to a very private wife in Edith, who destroyed a lot of their correspondence. If we had some of that, that might change the contours of our analysis a little bit. But I just don't see it there in his writings, and so I'm hesitant to make strong judgments.
Are there other questions? There's one back here. Yes, two more. Joe?
Thank you kindly. Professor Wetzel, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'll put in a quick plug. It was a wonderful delight to co-host the Theodore Roosevelt Association Strenuous Life Adventure here. Our next visit will be to the Northwoods of Maine, where we'll visit in part the place that is now a state historic site called Bible Point, where we understand Theodore Roosevelt, in the aftermath of his father's death, studied his Bible. I'm, for the first time ever, going to reference my phone to ask a question or place a statement. You're probably familiar with the fact that Theodore Roosevelt, at the invitation of a Bible society, wrote an introduction to a copy of the New Testament being given to American soldiers headed to France. And he wrote in his introduction, "The teaching of the New Testament is foreshadowed in Micah's verse. What more doth the Lord require of thee than to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God?" Unquote. Do justice, and therefore fight valiantly against those that stand for the reign of Moloch and Beelzebub on this earth. Love mercy, treat your enemies well, succor the afflicted, treat every woman as if she were your sister, care for the little children, and be tender with the old and helpless. Walk humbly. You will do so if you study the life and teachings of the Savior, walking in his steps. It goes on, but to me, searching for a statement of his faith late in life, this is an important aspect that I've been able to share.
And yet it's amazing how much Old Testament language there is in it. Yes.
Moloch and Beelzebub. I mean, what politician uses this language? Moloch and Beelzebub. And he knows the Bible. Micah 6:8 is another one, like the James 2 that I referenced as kind of one of his life verses, or something that he frequently comes back to. I think he's strongest on the justice, weaker on mercy, and not at all there on humility when it comes to that. But that's very, very important for him. And thank you for reminding me of that.
There's a question over here somewhere. No? Yes.
Did Theodore Roosevelt experience any major backlash for tolerance with individuals that had different political, or not political, religious beliefs? And did he get any backlash for advocating for these individuals to be in political positions?
Yeah, that's a great question. He'll describe in letters, I think, to one of his sons about certain narrow-minded Protestants who are just focused on the righteousness of their denomination, and they therefore object to his defense of Unitarians or Catholics or something like that. I don't think it was a big issue for him, and although he could be very thin-skinned and very inclined to argue at length with people who disagreed with him, I don't recall long letters to people justifying his ecumenical approach necessarily. So yes, in some of the most strict kind of denominations, I think there's concern that he's not really one of us, that he tolerates heresies or dangerous denominations, but I don't think it has a lot of lasting political impact on him necessarily. Yeah, but thank you for that. It's very good.
Yes, we got two more here. One right down here, David.
Yeah, I'm sorry, there's no microphone, but...
It's coming, wait, because we're streaming.
Okay. So I'm just, first off, Ben, you've done a great job here, always have, and Terry's so fortunate to have been able to award you that award. Let me just say that from the other way to you. But I look at, from my background, which is a lot of years in the Navy, I look at what you look at to TR as, which is the moral character of the person and the leader of men, right, at the time. And I think that could not have happened without a strong background in faith and what he had. So he didn't particularly say which faith, but I do think that moral character comes out to say, you can't make a better image for a ship, for example, a carrier at sea, than to have that namesake there. And his moral character that pervades out there says there can be no greater satisfaction in life than doing work that is well worth doing. And that motivates people. And so to me, it goes back to the core of his being, which is that moral character. And that comes from somewhere.
Yeah, that comes from somewhere. Again, yeah, his church upbringing, religious training, and I think, I won't psychologize. I know we talked about a little bit the dangers of that last night a little bit, but Theodore Sr. was in his head, I think, a lot. I think he was very influential on him as a child, obviously, in his untimely death. Maybe reinforced some of those things. And Theodore Sr. was strict. He had what he called the troublesome conscience, and I think some of that for sure got passed on to TR as well.
The importance of Thee can't be overestimated in the religious formation of his son.
Right.
So a couple quick questions. One, in God We Trust, removed from the coin, is that aesthetic or is that religious or neither?
It's both, at least as he tells the story. I think it's primarily aesthetic. So that would be a good example of backlash, actually. So there's this incident, I think it's 1905, where they're going to redo the coinage, and Augustus St. Gaudens is brought in to design this. And Roosevelt wants, in God We Trust, taken off the coins. And he defends it as it's impious, actually, to have the name of God on mammon, to combine God and mammon. The people make all these jokes about it, especially in a free silver kind of 16-to-1 sort of context. And so, you know, I'm actually doing this out of reverence for the divine being who shouldn't be stamped on our coins. But people just don't want to hear it. I mean, this is actually where he gets the most, probably, editorials and things like this, that this is sacrilegious. I can't believe we have a president who doesn't want God in our coins. This country is going to rack and ruin. And he just gives in and just it's still there. That's a battle he doesn't win. And if I'm taking him ultra seriously, I'll say that was an ultra commitment to the separation of church and state. But I think there was some aesthetic part of it back there.
Let me ask you one last question about Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Because if you think of the presidents of the United States who have been most firm about separation of church and state, certainly they're two of the highest. Yeah. And yet we know that TR was not a fan of Thomas Jefferson. He regarded him as a weak president, and that he had underserved the Navy, and that he had made the War of 1812 inevitable, he and Madison, and that Jefferson was sort of not there in the arena when the moments came. Does he refer much to Jefferson's separation of church and state? Jefferson's high doctrine, and Roosevelt's more practical on this question.
Yeah, good question. I don't recall, which again doesn't mean it's not there, but I don't think he references Jefferson too much on that. What I recall is what you were saying of him as, of course, not in a party that became a heritage of the Republican Party. So he's a Democratic Republican kind of Democrat. So that's one strike against him. And then the Navy and the War of 1812 and those things. I don't remember him referencing that. I'm not sure when Jefferson's image about the wall of separation became more current in American discourse. I have to look into that, but it is a good connection.
And so, remember in the letter to Taft, he said, invoke Jefferson as a Unitarian.
Right.
So
well,
at least
and Jefferson is someone who was always rumors about his lack of piety, who did cut up the Bible and had the kind of his own Jefferson Bible, and that didn't stop him from being a famous president, and shouldn't stop you from getting votes either.
Let me close. This is going to close with this. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but I want to ask you kind of a follow-up to that comes from something you said earlier, that there is this tendency in American life to want our presidents who are not deeply Christian to be way more Christian than they were. This happens with Jefferson all the time. And of course, it can't be done. You can't force Jefferson into being a Trinitarian because he explicitly denied the Trinity. Roosevelt's a little less adamant about that sort of thing, but what is this characteristic we have of being unable to let them be what they are?
Well, I think it just goes back to that strong Protestant heritage that goes back to the 18th century, and certainly even better in the early 19th century with the Second Great Awakening and with the influx of Protestant reform movements that come out of that tradition. And we can go back to the Puritans. I mean, if you really want to go back to the 17th century, that's in the 19th century, that's who Americans tell themselves who they are. They don't go to Jamestown. They go to, well, for good reason, but they go to the Pilgrims, they go to the Puritans as the ancestors that they've chosen. And so who we tell ourselves who we are impinges on who we want our presidents to be, who we want our leaders to be today, too. And so if we are a kind of low church, Puritan, Protestant nation, we say, in circa 1900, then we want people to live up to that and not to be anti-Trinitarians or whatever. So I think it goes deep into our blood.
This makes for a fair amount of hypocrisy in our
Well,
politics.
sure, absolutely, absolutely.
Benjamin Wetzel, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.